that it can't really be stopped. All the other versions of the Joker toxin that exist out there, those have antidotes, right? That's what Bruce Wayne's been using over the years, is using those antidotes to those versions of the Joker toxin, synthesizing an antidote if the toxin is new, and then using it to cure people. This is a perfect strain. It's a perfectly pure strain, and so there is no antidote to it. There's no conceivable way to overcome it, and so the best that Bruce can do is stave it off. And so while that's happening, what he's trying to do here is understand what the Batman Who Laughs is trying to do. And so in the midst of all this, while all that's going on, what we end up having is some guy who's driving, and suddenly like a version of Bruce Wayne lands on top of his car. Now, this brings in Commissioner Gordon, and it brings in what appears to be Harvey Bullock. Now, with Commissioner Gordon, he's kind of working on the other half of this case. The first part of the case, kind of the front side, is the Batman Who Laughs is back, what's his plan? The back side is all these different versions of Bruce Wayne from what are basically what seem to be like the Dark Multiverse are popping out. Now, that's kind of the caveat, is initially it seemed to be Dark Multiverse versions of Bruce Wayne. This does not appear to be true. Instead, what seems to be are versions of Bruce from across the multiverse, not versions of Bruce Wayne from the Dark Multiverse. And the reason why is because with that multiverse itself, it was basically full of what like worst case scenarios. What if Superman became a bad guy and killed everybody on Earth? What if Batman became a Joker and then became an evil version of Batman? Like, that's the kind of thing we see in Dark Multiverse. This version of Bruce, the other version who had died, and the other versions that have appeared off panel that have been discovered by Commissioner Gordon are good versions of Bruce. This one in particular was actually mayor of Gotham City. The problem with this is that while all that happens, one of the rookies basically walks up to Harvey Bullock, starts talking to him, and Harvey Bullock starts freaking out. And that's when we end up learning this is actually Bruce Wayne with the Joker toxin. And that's what's so crazy about this, is Bruce is walking his knife set. At any moment, he could fall over. He could literally flip over to the other side and become the Joker. He's doing the best he can to kind of hold it together, but there's a limit to all this. The other half, and this is one of the cool things about Scott Snyder writing, is Bruce reveals something we didn't really know before. And so one of the things he does here is he draws what's basically called the last laugh. And the idea was that if Gotham City were ever attacked, just to say, if there was a chemical weapon, or if there was some kind of toxin that was released across the city, or whatever it is, but the city itself just sort of fell into absolute madness, that there were all these tunnels that had been designed over the years. They would basically allow for fast travel like food and supplies, and means by which the city could essentially be fixed. But what Bruce Wayne has been working on is his own version of last laugh. Because of the fact that the Joker toxin is so powerful, and presumably coming out of the events of Batman Endgame, one of the things that Bruce Wayne devised is that there had to be a means by which the city could be cured. He could literally pump an antidote into the entire city itself and cure everything. And so by working on that, one of the things he says is that this is a system by which Gotham can be saved, but it's also a system by which Gotham can be destroyed. And the initial response of Commissioner Gordon is, well, then what's the huge concern here? And the response of Bruce Wayne is to say that you can only access it using DNA. And that's when we pick up with the Batman Who Laughs. And that's what's so great about this, is because the Batman Who Laughs is an evil version of Bruce. He essentially had all the same experiences as Bruce Wayne up until the point when the Joker died, and he was taking the toxin and then went crazy. And so because he thinks, he feels, he functions in the exact same way as Bruce Wayne in the main DC universe, he would do the exact same things Bruce would, which means he's aware of the exact same things Bruce does. And so that's when Bruce Snyder kind of tells us indirectly that all these things that Bruce Wayne's doing in the main DC universe, the Batman Who Laughs did in his universe. And so with that happening, with that in mind, Batman Who Laughs shows up at Wayne Manor, which is the only access point to this last laugh tunnel that Bruce Wayne's been building, and then in turn basically begins to access it. Now, the only real guardian here is a guy named Bill, and the initial inclination is like, how does Bill not know this is Bruce Wayne? Only for us to find out that Bill's blind. And so it's kind of a cool thing, because what this would do is it would actually allow Bruce Wayne to access this aspect of Wayne Tower, and for Bill to never really know Bruce Wayne's face, or at least to never really know that it was actually him. Now, the fact that Bill refers to him as Mr. Wayne indicates that Bill knows exactly who Bruce Wayne is, and the Batman Who Laughs makes his way in there. And when he does, we see an aspect of his character we don't normally see. When it comes to this version of Bruce, and when we saw him in Dark Knight's Metal, he was really more like the second in command. He was a guy who was running alongside Barbados. But when you throw him into the story, what it does is it shows he's just as capable as we would expect. It's all the formidable abilities of Bruce Wayne combined with the insanity of the Joker, which basically makes for him going through and killing every single member of Wayne security inside this section of Wayne Tower with no limits whatsoever. One of the other cool things here, and to really kind of underscore the fact that he and Bruce think so much alike, is that once all these guys are dead, he counts down, and 3, 2, 1, bam, enters Batman. And that's kind of the cool thing here, is because what it means and what it really shows here is that Bruce Wayne fighting this evil version of himself, that it really seems to be an even match. And in fact, as this fight unfolds, Bruce comments on it proper, that he says, well, I'm stronger, but I'm not faster. And so because of the fact that he's able to fight so capably, what this means is he can overcome me. Because of the fact that he knows exactly how I function, he knows the weaknesses, he knows what kind of weapons he needs in order to overcome my various suits of armor and the kind of defense mechanisms that I employ. And it's kind of a funny thing here, because Bruce gets the upper hand hand on the Batman Who Laughs. And when Bruce kind of basically says like your whole plan's not here, the response to Batman Who Laughs is, what makes you think this is not part of mine? And that's the cool, that's why I love so much about his character. Scott Snyder writes him in such a way that you have to assume everything that happens according to the will of the Batman Who Laughs. That if he's defeated, it's because he wanted to be defeated, because he wanted to be taken to a particular location, and he knew he would be taken to that location if he was defeated, because he knows how Batman works. And so you have to assume that he knows everything that's going to happen, or at the very least, has planned it all out ahead of time. And this all really comes to a head when Bruce Wayne is shot. And this is cool, because what Batman Who Laughs does is he says, there's basically this guy out there, this version of Bruce Wayne who's out there, who's called the Grim Knight. He's basically Batman as the president. That this version of Bruce Wayne is far more extreme, and the way he came into existence was by virtue of the fact that when Joe Chill shot Thomas and Martha, Bruce Wayne picked up a gun and shot Joe Chill. The implication seems to be that Joe Chill shot Thomas and Martha and then dropped the gun out of perhaps panic or fear, whatever the case was, and ran. And in that moment, Bruce Wayne picked the gun up and shot Joe Chill. And that set him on the path of killing every criminal he finds. And so what Batman Who Laughs does is kind of reveal everything to Bruce and say, you built this entire place in order to ensure that Gotham could be saved in the event of an emergency by pumping out something antidote. I'm going to use it as a means to destroy this. And the response of Bruce is, well, you can't do that because the building can only really be used in that regard. And the response of Batman Who Laughs is, I know. And all these safeguards that you have in place have all been dismantled by the Grim Knight. He's done it all over the last couple of days. So I'm going to destroy this building, and I'm going to destroy your ability to basically save the city of Gotham. In this moment, there's nothing that can be done. There's nothing Bruce Wayne can do. The best he can do is escape. He grabs Bill, he uses one of those little grappling hooks, they escape Wayne's horn, and the entire building comes crashing down around. And so what this means is the means by which Gotham can be saved based on whatever plan the Batman Who Laughs has is gone. There's no real way to believe that it can be done in any real measure of time, because you have to assume that whatever plan it is the Batman Who Laughs has, whatever plan he has based, is going to be predicated on what Bruce Wayne would most likely do. So again, overcoming the odds by knowing how his enemy functions. And so with Bruce Wayne returning back to Wayne Manor and running up to Alfred, it's wake the Joker up. You have to wake him up. Now what we end up realizing here is Joker's been awake the entire time. He's been listening to the discussions of Bruce and Alfred, and where he's been kind of laughing and they've been assuming it's a reaction, in reality, he's laughing at the futility of their choices. He's laughing at the futility of their efforts to try to stop the Batman Who Laughs. Because the response of, really with Bruce here, the idea is you have to know the answer. You have to know what it is that the Batman Who Laughs wants. He's basically you from an alternate reality. Only you really seem to be the one that knows how his mind works. Tell me what he's going to do. And the response of the Joker is, I don't know what he's going to do. There's only one person out there in the entire world who knows exactly what it is that Batman Who Laughs is going to do. And that person is none other than James Gordon Jr., the son of Commissioner Gordon and the guy who's basically nuts. Okay, so we are uploading this kind of late because I just got back from Disney World. Had an amazing trip. It was awesome. I'll probably have a video about it on my vlogging channel. But we are covering the Batman Who Laughs Part 3. And in the last video, we basically picked up with essentially the return of James Gordon Jr. Now, James Gordon Jr. is the son of Commissioner Gordon, of James Gordon, and of course the brother of Barbara Gordon, Batgirl. But the cool thing about James Gordon Jr. is that imagine the Joker if he was rational, which I know kind of takes away from the premise of like a psychopath. But when it comes to James Gordon Jr., he's one of these guys where all he did was like think and plan ways to like wipe out people, destroy things, cause as much like, pandemonium and chaos as he possibly could. And so because of that, of course, he was basically in prison, and of course he was put on a program where it was basically a drug that was produced by Wayne Pharmaceuticals that could essentially cure a person who was a psychopath. And if I remember correctly from Batman Eternal and from Forever Evil, the idea was to test the drug on James Gordon Jr. to see if it would work on like the Joker or somebody like that. So he was kind of a test subject more or less. But for the most part, it's been working. Like he takes 2 shots a day, like tests his blood, to make sure that everything's still in effect and so on and so forth. It gets kind of nuts in terms of how he lives his life. But it's super, super strict to make sure he doesn't go back to doing what he was doing before. But the idea behind this is, for those guys who are catching up, the idea behind this was that the Joker, when he was taken prisoner by Batman, or really kind of brought in by Batman and then so on, everything kind of unfolded, is that James Gordon Jr. is the key to stopping the Batman Who Laughs. And we didn't really know how far this key extended, right? Like we didn't really know what doors it unlocked, but that's essentially what this kind of does. When you have James Gordon meeting with his son, it's really kind of Scott Snyder giving us this refresher and saying, here's what James has been doing. But then of course the group is met with the arrival of Batman. And this is when things get kind of cool, because what Bruce says under a normal circumstance, when Bruce Wayne approaches someone like this, he wants them for a particular purpose, but he wants to make sure that things stay on the up and up. When he approaches James Gordon Jr., what he says is, I don't want the version that's doing what he's supposed to do. Like, I don't want the one who's a good guy. I want the murderer. Like, I want the murderer, the killer, the crazy psychopath. That's the version that I want. And the whole idea behind this is, as Batman explains, is that the Batman Who Laughs is implementing a plan to essentially like destroy Gotham. Now, we don't know exactly what this plan is in its entirety. We just know like the Batman Who Laughs wants to unleash pandemonium and chaos. And the way that Snyder plays this out is it looks like it'll be something that's far more extreme than like Batman Endgame. For those of you guys who never read Batman Endgame, what we ended up finding out was the Joker had this plan to essentially release Joker toxin across the entire city of Gotham and to send the city into like mass hysteria and into like, you know, chaos and panic and so on and so forth. And it worked. He actually did it. Like it was kind of nuts the way it all played out. But of course, with Batman using the last laugh plan, which was essentially using like the tunnels of Gotham to essentially pump out like a cure to the Joker toxin, where all that's kind of out the window now. The idea is to know what the Batman Who Laughs plan is going to be. And because James Gordon Jr. is a legitimate psychopath who spent a majority of his life just like analyzing and trying to find ways to destroy things, he's the best person to go to, because right now they can't get answers from the Joker. And so it's kind of cool because what this is an act of desperation. While James Gordon Jr. is a psychopath, he's not exactly like the Batman Who Laughs. The Batman Who Laughs is a combination of the Joker and Batman. This is an answer to the question, what would happen if Batman became the Joker? And so the best person to go to is the Joker, but the Joker's not spilling the beans. He's not giving any real answer, and the only answer he did give is go find James Gordon Jr. He's the answer you're looking for. And so that's literally why Batman's following these breadcrumbs and following these directions, is because he doesn't really have a choice here. It's kind of funny because James Gordon Jr. does not want to do any of this stuff. James Gordon Jr. is like, I don't want to do this. Like, I do not want to jump into this scenario again. I don't want to go back to being that version of myself. So he's very much against the idea, which really kind of ties Batman's hands. And so when they try to reason with him and they say like, put down the scanner and like talk to us, he says like, I'm not the one with this red dot, meaning somebody's targeting them. And that's when like all hell starts to break loose, because of course the group is met by the arrival of what's basically Punisher Batman. And this is cool because Punisher Batman and like Batman himself actually face off against each other. It's basically a guy who's shooting to kill versus a guy who's not. And they're able to like dodge the attacks of each other. So for the most part, it's a stalemate insofar as one of them kind of gets the upper hand. You know, Batman kind of gets the upper hand on Punisher Batman, but not really. And the reason why is because where Punisher Batman's kind of caught unawares with like a grappling hook and basically kind of left dangling over a bridge and whatnot, you end up having him basically like bring in all these different vehicles and so on, and then say like, there's a jet flying above us, and if you do not give me James Gordon, I'm going to destroy it. I'm going to destroy one of its engines. This is cool because what this does is it again hints at the idea and really kind of points to the idea of how capable this evil alternate reality version of Batman is. That in his universe, there are no villains. There's no Joker, no Scarecrow, no Penguin, no Two-Face, no nothing. He's killed them all. That he has basically gone through and like essentially like controls the entire city of Gotham, right? Even hits it like, you know, hits home with what he calls the cone. And so that's really kind of Scott Snyder basically bringing in the idea of like Tom King and James Tynion Batman run, or Batman Detective Comics run, when you have the cone, right? Like this organization that essentially kind of took over kind of a paramilitary group, the father of Batwoman, who wanted to take over Gotham City, and then like basically weaponized Batman's technology to essentially control the city of Gotham. And then in alternate reality, this Punisher Batman's done that. And so being that capable, he's basically began colonizing Gotham City in like the main DC universe by basically saying like, I know everything that's going on everywhere, or at least, you know, I'm getting to the point where I am. And so him basically saying like, if you don't do what I tell you to, then I'm going to take out this plane, 72 people are going to die, 41 of them are Gothamites, I'm going to kill them all you have to do is give me Commissioner Gordon and it all goes away. And where Gordon is kind of like, where he believes that it's his son that he's talking about, the response of Batman is, it's not the son, it's you. And he literally knocks out Commissioner Gordon and hands him over to like Punisher Batman. And the idea behind this, at least, you know, in terms of why this is being done, is Batman says that when it came to like the whole last laugh device that he had, the device that would serve the purpose of like allowing a cure to be implemented throughout the city of Gotham, required like a 2-point activation. It required Batman and someone who trusted, the only one person he really trusts, being Commissioner Gordon. Now, switching over to the Iceberg Lounge to Penguin, it's kind of cool here because of course the Batman Who Laughs basically busts in and starts torching the place, literally using the various weapons and gimmicks of the Joker, of Penguin, to start tearing everything up and start letting everything, you know, setting everything on fire. Now, some of the gimmicks that really seem to be brought here by Batman Who Laughs seem to be gimmicks from his own universe. Just to say, like one of the I guess, you know, an umbrella of the Penguin that can shoot alcohol, which in turn, if given a flame, can set everything on fire. Just small little things like that that are really interesting and really was smart for him to use in this scenario by literally taking out all the forces of Penguin and then bringing in another version of Bruce Wayne. And in this alternate reality version of Bruce, this is the version that actually tried to reason with the Penguin. They tried to like work alongside the Penguin and actually became a criminal lord himself, and then rose to power and gained more power than the Penguin did. And then the tables turned, so that when Penguin was basically losing all this power, and all this money, he tried to reason with this version of Bruce, but was always pushed out. So this version of Bruce Wayne is basically a mob boss, and it's kind of cool to see. Like, he's dark, he's sinister, and it's interesting to see that happen because, of course, the Batman